Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going deep on a topic a lot of you have been asking about: military intervention in politics.
Ah, a classic.
Yeah. To help us dig into this, our listener sent over a fascinating book, The Man on Horseback.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It really gets into, all the reasons why the military gets involved in politics, the different ways they do it, and, which countries are more susceptible to this kind of, well, interference.
Right, right. All crucial questions.
Yeah, so let's jump right in. I think most people, when they think of military intervention, they picture, the classic coup d'etat, like tanks in the streets, dramatic announcements on the radio, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, the Hollywood version.
Exactly. But I have a feeling it's not always so dramatic in real life, is it?
Not at all. In fact, the Man on Horseback makes it clear there are several levels of intervention. Some are surprisingly subtle.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So what does that look like, this subtle intervention?
Well, think about it. A military advising a civilian government on security matters. That's pretty common.
Right. Makes sense. They are the experts in warfare and defense.
Exactly. But you can see how that advice could easily turn into pressure. Or even, threats and blackmail.
So it's a bit of a slippery slope.
You could say that. I mean, look at Japan in the 1930s. The army assassinated politicians who opposed their expansionist plans.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely taking it to another level. So where do we go from there? What's the next level of intervention beyond just this kind of pressure?
Well, the book calls it displacement. The military removes a leader, or maybe a whole cabinet, and forces the installation of a new one.
Okay, so not overthrowing the whole system, just swapping out the players.
Exactly. A classic example is General Bakr Siddiqui's takeover in Baghdad in 1936. He basically forced a new cabinet, one that was, well, more sympathetic to the military.
I see. So influence, then displacement. What's the final, most extreme level?
That would be supplantement, the complete takeover, sweeping away the civilian government and establishing direct military rule, the classic coup.
Right, right. Although even then, it seems like they often try to maintain some kind of facade of civilian government, right?
Oh, absolutely. Egypt under Nasser is a great example. The officers originally just wanted to get rid of the government, but they ended up becoming the new ruling class themselves, behind a, shall we say, thin veil of civilian institutions.
Fascinating. So we've got these different levels of intervention, but the question is why? Why do they do it? I mean, the military is supposed to defend the country, not run it.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The book dives into that, and it argues that part of the answer lies in the military's nature. It's what they call a purposive instrument designed for fighting wars.
Purposive instrument.
I like
That. But how does that translate to getting involved in politics?
Well, think about the things that make a military effective. Centralized command, a strict hierarchy, discipline, seamless communication, that strong esprit de corps.
Yeah, makes sense. Those are all good qualities in a fighting force.
Right. But those same qualities can also cause friction with civilian authorities. The military is used to giving orders, not taking them. And those strong internal bonds, they can lead to a sense of isolation, even distrust of the civilian world.
So it's almost like they think they know better, that they're the only ones who can really protect the nation.
It's a common theme, and it leads to one of the most frequent motives for intervention, defending what they see as their autonomy, pushing back against any civilian policies they see as interference.
I can see that. But I imagine there are other, maybe less noble motivations at play as well.
Oh, of course. There's always the self-interest angle, protecting their budget, expanding their influence, things like that.
The classic power struggle. But what about this idea of acting in the national interest? That always seems to be a big part of the justification.
It does, doesn't it? And on the surface, it sounds pretty noble. But you always have to ask, who gets to define what that national interest is?
All right, good point. National interest can be a very slippery concept.
Absolutely. And then you also have the factor of regionalism.
Regionalism, you mean divisions within the military itself?
Exactly. The military isn't always this unified force. You might have factions that favor certain regions or groups over others, and that can play a big role in these interventions.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good grasp on the why. Now, what about the where? Why are some countries more vulnerable to this kind of military interference than others?
That's where the idea of political culture comes in. Countries with what the book calls a low level of political culture, they tend to be much more susceptible.
Political culture. Can you unpack that a bit? What exactly does that mean?
Think of it as a society's, well, its shared values and beliefs,
Yeah.
the attitudes towards politics. In a country with low political culture, people might not have much experience with democracy, or there might be deep disagreements about how power should be distributed.
So basically, places where democracy hasn't quite taken root.
Exactly. In those situations, people might be more likely to accept military intervention, especially if it's presented as a way to restore order.
Right, because it's seen as a strong hand, a source of stability.
That's the idea. And to illustrate this, think about some contrasting examples. Countries like the US or Britain, they have high political cultures, strong civilian institutions, a long history of civilian control over the military. Military intervention is incredibly rare there.
Right, there's this ingrained belief in democracy and a healthy suspicion of anyone in uniform trying to overstep.
Precisely. On the other hand, you have a lot of countries in Latin America, the Middle East, parts of post-colonial Africa that have struggled to establish those strong civilian institutions, and that makes them far more vulnerable.
It's almost like a vicious cycle, isn't it? Weak institutions lead to instability, which then justifies the military stepping in, which further weakens those institutions.
It's a dangerous pattern, that's for sure. And once the military has a taste of power, well, getting them to go back to the barracks can be a whole other challenge.
Speaking of which, is it even possible for them to fully withdraw from politics, to return to a purely professional role? Or is that just wishful thinking?
Well, that's a question we'll have to dig into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, now I'm hooked. I need to know what happens next.
Don't worry, we'll get there. It's a fascinating journey.
Okay, so we've established that getting the military out of politics can be a real challenge. But let's say they've already intervened. They're in charge. What happens then? How do these military regimes actually, govern? Is it all just marching orders and military tribunals?
Well, some certainly try to project that image, the iron fist approach, but a lot of them actually try to soften things a bit, incorporate civilian elements. The man on horseback calls this quasi-civilianized rule.
Quasi-civilianized. So like putting on a Democratic costume party but still running the show behind the scenes?
That's a pretty good way to put it. It's about balancing control with legitimacy. They want to look good, both domestically and to the international community.
All right, so how do they pull that off? What are some of the tactics they use?
Well, there's a whole spectrum. On one end, you have direct military rule, no pretense there. Take General Gürsel in Turkey, for example. He led the coup, headed a national unity committee made up entirely of officers.
Okay, straight from the barracks to the government, but that's not always how it goes, right?
Right. That kind of overt military control can be unsustainable. It can lead to a lot of pushback. So a lot of regimes take a more subtle approach. They might appoint a civilian cabinet, carefully chosen, of course, to handle the day-to-day governing.
So they're basically outsourcing the boring parts of running a country.
Something like that. And it get even more complex. They might set up institutions that look independent, like advisory councils or legislative bodies, but in reality, they're controlled by the military.
So it's all a bit of a facade. They're creating these institutions that look democratic, but the military is still calling the shots.
It can be, but sometimes it's a bit more nuanced than that. The military might genuinely believe that what they're doing is best for the country. They might see these institutions as a step towards stability, maybe even eventual civilian rule.
Okay, but if they're so confident in their intentions, why not just hold free and fair elections? Why bother with this whole charade?
That gets to the heart of it, the legitimacy problem. Military regimes, even the ones with, let's say, good intentions, they often struggle to get real popular support. And elections are risky. You might lose.
And we know the military doesn't like to lose.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So instead of risking a genuine election, they might hold these carefully controlled elections or even just staged plebiscites to try to create the illusion of popular approval.
It's all about manufacturing consent.
In many cases, yes, but it's a risky strategy. People can usually see through it.
Right, and that's when those cracks in the facade start to show.
Exactly. It's this constant balancing act. The need for control versus the need to at least appear legitimate.
We talked earlier about Egypt under Nasser. Can you tell us a bit more about how that regime evolved?
Oh, it's a classic case. It really shows how a military intervention that starts out as a limited attempt to, displace a leader can gradually transform into something much more entrenched.
Kind of like mission creep, but on a political scale.
A very apt comparison. Remember, Nasser and the free officers, initially they just wanted to get rid of the monarchy. They weren't necessarily planning on taking over the whole country.
So how did that happen? How did they end up in charge?
Well, they went through several phases. First, you had the Revolutionary Command Council, all military officers, very similar to Gursul in Turkey. But they quickly realized that wouldn't work, so they started incorporating civilian elements.
Okay, so they were trying to soften their image a bit, make it look less like a straight-up military dictatorship.
Right. They appointed a civilian prime minister, held elections, although, of course, those were tightly controlled, eventually established a national union, kind of a single-party system.
So on paper, it was starting to look like a more, well, normal government.
Yes, but in reality, the military was still very much in control. That national union was largely a way to control the political landscape. And Nasser himself, even though he eventually dropped his military title, was the clear leader.
A president in all but name.
Exactly, and that's why the Egyptian case is so important. It shows just how hard it is to separate the military from politics once they've gotten that foothold. Even when they create these quasi-civilian structures, they often retain a lot of power behind the scenes.
It makes you wonder if these quasi-civilian regimes can ever really transition to actual democracies. Or if they're just inherently, well, flawed, designed to keep the military in charge, even if it's not obvious.
That's the big question, isn't it? Can a system that was created to consolidate military power ever truly become democratic?
That's what I'm really curious about. We've identified some serious challenges here, but I'm hoping there's a way forward, some way to break out of these cycles of intervention and stability.
Well, that's what we'll explore in the last part of our deep dive. We'll look at the things that make these successful transitions possible and the obstacles that stand in the way.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into military intervention. And if I remember correctly, we left off with a pretty big question. Can these quasi-civilian regimes ever really make that transition to, well, genuine democracies?
That's the fundamental challenge, isn't it? It's not just about getting certain individuals out of power. It's about creating a system where those interventions become, well, unthinkable, building a political culture that truly values civilian rule.
Right, right. But that sounds incredibly difficult. How do you even begin to make that kind of change, especially in countries that don't have much experience with democracy?
It's definitely a long-term process. But the man on horseback does offer some clues. And maybe surprisingly, it starts with the military itself.
With the military. Really, that seems a little, I don't know, counterintuitive.
I know, it sounds strange, but for any transition to work, the military has to be on board. They have to accept their role as defenders, not rulers.
Okay, but how do you convince an institution that's used to having power to, just give it up?
It's not easy. It requires a real shift in mindset. The military leadership has to, well, they have to recognize that their expertise lies in military affairs, not governing. And they have to buy into the idea that a functioning democracy is actually in everyone's best interest, including theirs.
So a bit of humility is needed.
You could say that, but it's not just about the military. Civilian leaders have to step up too. They need to assert their authority, make it clear that the military is subordinate to civilian control.
So it's about drawing the line in the sand.
Yes, and backing that up with action, civilian leaders have to govern effectively. They need to prove that they can provide stability, security, all those things.
Right, so they have to show that they're actually capable of running the country.
Exactly. It's about building confidence in those civilian institutions, making the idea of the military stepping in less appealing.
Okay, so we've got a willing military and strong civilian leadership. What else is needed?
Strong institutions. Things like political parties, a legislature that actually functions, an independent judiciary, a free press. Those are the pillars of a healthy democracy.
Right, it's about having those checks and balances in place.
Exactly. You don't want any one institution, especially not the military, to be able to dominate. But even the best institutions are only as good as the people who run them.
You're talking about the people's role.
Exactly. You need citizens who understand and value democratic principles, who participate in the process, hold their leaders accountable. They can't just sit back and hope someone else will fix things.
It's that idea of civic duty, right?
Yeah.
Democracy isn't a spectator sport.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yay.
But that kind of change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, education, dialogue. You have to be willing to confront the legacy of military rule.
It sounds like a long and difficult process.
It is, but I think the goal is worth it. A society where civilian rule is the norm, where the military understands and accepts its proper role, where democracy can thrive.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's a complicated topic and not always the most uplifting, but I think it's really important to understand.
My pleasure. These conversations are crucial, I think.
And to our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful. If you want to learn more, you know where to find us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions.